Welcome to Wadsworth History on Film, a program presented by the Wadsworth Area Historical Society and designed to record the oral history of Wadsworth for posterity. I'm your host, Cesar Carino, and our guest today is Bill Dague. Bill, you have a lot of reasons to be here today, not the least of which is that you have been in Wadsworth for the, 75 years or something like that? Or maybe longer? Off and on?
Yes.
I mean, you probably went to Akron a few times and Barton, places like that.
I even got to Cleveland once.
You got to Cleveland once or twice. That was wonderful. Bill, tell us a little bit about where you came from, who your parents were, and so forth, because one of your parents is going to play very heavily in this interview today, and we're going to learn all about him.
All right.
So tell us where you were born here in Wadsworth.
I was born at Wadsworth Hospital.
And what day? Do you remember? Are you sensitive about your age, Bill?
Not really.
Not really. Not that I've told.
No, if I live about 29 more days, I'll be 75.
75.
Right. And was born in the hospital here. Lived here about the first 10 or 11 years of my life. Lived on Maple Street.
Where on Maple?
Well, the house is no longer there, but the address was 124 Maple.
And that's probably
And
close.
that was a house that was torn down. It was right next to the only old house that currently stands there.
Right. And who was living there when you, before you people lived there? Do you remember?
I do not recall.
You don't recall who
No, I
lived
don't.
there?
Lived
And-
across the street prior to that. And the house is long since gone.
Right. City Halls took care of you, didn't they?
Yeah, and the bank and so forth on the other side of the street.
And the bank took care of you on the other side of the street. Now, you were born then, what was the date, so we have that?
November the 19th,
November
1922.
1922.
Right.
So that
Great
will make,
year.
Great years for good people.
Yeah.
Bill, you were not the firstborn in the family, though, were you?
Well, I'm an only child.
Well, then you were the firstborn.
Well, the onlyest one, right.
That's so true.
Right.
I kind of knew that you were only child, but I didn't want to lay that on you right off the bat.
Well, that's okay.
That's okay. Who were your parents?
Well, my mother was a lady by the name of Mary Ebright. She came from Akron.
Ebright, E-B-R-I-G-H-T.
That is correct.
Mary Ebright, okay. We'll spell a lot of names so that 20 or 30 years from now, if they write this history, they'll be able to get the names.
Right. And my father was William Irvin Dague.
W.I. Dague.
Right.
And W.I. Dague played a very important role in Wadsworth, and we're going to be getting to him. But when you were born, your parents had moved here from somewhere else. Is that correct? Or were they born here?
Well, my father was born, I think he was born in Western Star.
Western Star, which of course in those days was still Wadsworth.
For all intents and purposes.
Yeah, sure.
Like it is today.
I can still remember when they would say that Silver Creek was not part of Wadsworth. Well, it probably wasn't at one time. And River Styx was not part of Wadsworth. But it's all part and parcel of the same thing. We all went to the same schools together. Where was your father born in Western Star? Do you remember?
I think it was about the second or third house on the west side of the road, north on the County Line Road.
Oh.
I think the house still stands, though, although I'm not certain of that.
On the, you're on County Line Road.
West side.
On the west side, north of, what is now Broad Street?
224 Greenwich Road.
Right. Would that be the house that has the big pillars in front of it?
No, it's
No.
back further down in the level part.
And the level part, right below that then.
Right.
And that's
Just
where
a couple houses from the corner.
From the
if I
corner, that's where your
recall.
father was born.
Right.
Came to Wadsworth and stayed here for a good long time. Tell us about your early childhood, where you went to elementary school. And
Went
things
to
of this nature.
Lincoln Elementary School.
Do you remember any of your teachers? We've been trying to establish to see if we have any new teachers coming on
Oh,
board.
of course. I remember Miss Lottie Mills.
Everyone remembers Miss Lottie.
In fact, Miss Lottie Mills taught my father.
You kidding?
No, I'm not. So
What year would that have been?
when she taught him,
Well, he's what? How many years older than you is he?
well, he was born in 1888, so supposing he was
No, 6 years
12
old.
years old, 7, I don't know how old. But
So in the
she was
1900s.
in the early part of her career, no doubt.
I would imagine so.
Right.
So she must have been teaching in Wadsworth from the early 1900s or even the 1890-somethings, right?
I would gather.
Because she was an elementary teacher.
She was the principal when I was
She was the principal
taught
there, but-
third grade, as I remember, mathematics.
So let's say, for instance, she taught third grade to your father. Your father would be 10 years old, so it'd be 1898. She was probably still teaching at that time.
I would imagine.
And she taught for many years beyond that.
If I recall,
She surely
I don't.
Who were some of the other ones then, Bill, that you remember?
Well, there was Mr. Chester Hawk, I remember. He taught about the 5th or 6th grade.
You know, a lot of people have mentioned his names. Can you think of anything which was peculiar about him or particular about him or something that would identify him above all of the people in Chester Hawk?
Not really. I don't remember anything in particular. Then he taught later on. He taught in high school, like freshman English or something like that, if I recall correctly.
But he was just a regular teacher.
That's right.
And nothing extraordinary.
Not as far as I was concerned.
Didn't have any, he wasn't super big or super small or nerdy or anything like that. Just a good teacher.
Yes.
A good teacher. Right. Anybody else you remember?
Well, of course, about then was when I don't know her name now, but she was Miss Venner, and then later on she was Mrs. I'm sorry, I don't remember.
Okay,
she taught music.
Now, Miss Venner was related to whom in Wadsworth?
Well, she was related to the Venners that built the monuments down there by the cemetery.
Dick Venner.
Dick Venner her father was Dick, and she had a brother with the same name.
And you probably went to school with Dick Venner, the brother, didn't you?
No, he was older, somewhat older.
A little bit older?
Yeah, I don't know how many years.
So Miss Venner actually was a music teacher.
Yes, she was.
We're going to have one of the grandnephews of the elder Mr. Venner, or the grandson, I guess, the grandson of the elder Mr. Venner is going to be on our program a little later on.
That would be Dick's son. Dick's son.
That's right. So that'd be the son of Dick and then the grandson of the person who started the programs. Now, there probably were no such things as secretaries in the schools at that time. Is that right, Bill?
I don't recall being secretaries, no.
Now, do you remember some of the kids who went to school with you in the elementary grades?
Yeah, but I hesitate to say them. I'm fear that I'd overlook somebody that I obviously should. I just prefer not to say.
Okay, no problem at all. Right. None. Did you have any particular person with whom you played a great deal, neighbor or whatever?
Well, I used to play with Bill Barton, lived right behind us.
Now, Bill Barton was the son of
Sam Barton.
Sam Barton.
Right.
Sam Barton lived to be 101 years old.
Right.
He
Roaring
died.
Barton.
That's right.
Roaring Barton, I should say.
Roaring Barton. Sam Barton died after he fell, but he fell while he was running into a convenience store to get some milk or bread or something like that. At age 100.
Very ripe old age.
Yes.
Very fine milk.
He could still run at age 100.
Yeah.
A tremendous person. And then Bill Barton did what in Wadsworth?
Well, he was a great athlete here and went on to coach here, and then he went, of course, to Elyria, where he had a very fine career.
Right. Bill Barton was an outstanding
he was a year
athlete.
younger, but he was a neighbor to the rear. And Jack Taggart and Bill Parmley lived on the corner of Lyman and Broad Street there years back.
Now, Bill Parmley was older than you, though.
No, he's a year younger than I.
Bill Parmley?
In fact, there's a gentleman that you ought to have on your program, because he'd had a lot of great recollections of Wadsworth.
We've been trying to get some of the Parmleys on the program, and they're hard to get.
He would be a natural.
If you can get Parmleys on the program, I'll be very, very much indebted to you.
I'll work on it.
Bill, you have to know that for every person we have in this program, I call 5 people.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, yes. It's very difficult to get anyone to come before a television camera. And now that you've been on here for...
Candidly, I wish that had been a little more difficult.
Well, you weren't too easy to get, I have to tell you that.
Right.
Bill, a couple other things about your boyhood days. You lived right close to the center of town.
Right, on Maple Street, obviously.
Right, and you walked to town somewhat frequently. What do you remember about the stores, let's say on the east side of High Street, as you would walk down to the center of town?
East side of High Street.
Right, north of the square and on the east side of High Street.
Well, of course, there was Brenneman's Pharmacy there for years.
Right on the corner, then what?
Right. And you went up there and you had a dress shop, I remember.
Bee's Dress.
Hey, you're right on.
Lee Vennick.
And then back years before that, the Acme store was in there. And
who ran the Acme store?
Oh, I should know his name. Mose.
Mo.
Wasn't it?
Mosier.
Mosier. Of course.
That's
It was.
right, yeah.
Right, Mosier. And then next up, I don't know if it was Mosier. It was Mosier.
That's right.
Right, Mosier. And then next up, I don't know if it was Mosier. It was Mosier. And then next up, Mr. Miller had a butcher shop in there.
Uh-huh.
And then, of course, along in there, Lorenz's had a grocery store. And up a little farther was, of course, the telephone office, and then the Markley's Restaurant.
Markley's Restaurant.
Markley's Restaurant, right.
Who
It was a two-story.
Who were the Markleys? Who were the Markleys, Bill?
Well, Mrs. Markley ran the restaurant. That's, I remember, it used to be a treat to me to be able to go and have lunch in Markley's Restaurant once in a while.
And you were able to do that?
Oh, on occasion, rare occasions.
Do you remember the kinds of fares that Markley's Restaurant had?
She was great on beef stew, as I remember.
That's what I wanted to hear you say. Everyone loved her beef stew.
That is correct.
Do you remember how much it cost?
Oh, mercy. I really have no idea, but I don't suppose it was over 10 or 15 cents.
That's right.
It couldn't have been much more than that in those days.
And but it was 10 or 15 cents was hard to come by in those days. Right?
Yes, you could have a big time for it.
Bill, as you go up farther north there, then we now have the City Hall there, the older City Hall that was torn down before. It was built in 1935, at least part of it was built in 1935 by the WPA. You were a young lad at the time, but you were about 9 years old.
Prior to that, Perry Winkleman had a blacksmith shop.
Perry Winkleman had a blacksmith shop.
Right, and right. I can vaguely recall going there and watching them shoe horses and things of that nature.
Now, do you remember Perry Winkleman at all?
Yes, I do, because later on he moved up onto High Street, the corner of High Street and Prospect, I think it is, and had a blacksmith shop behind his house there.
If you have any doubts at all about why we brought you on the program, if we brought you on for no other reason than to tell us about Perry Winkleman, it would be worth it, because no one has mentioned Perry Winkleman yet.
Well,
tell us about Perry Winkleman.
I can't tell you much more than that. He was a blacksmith, and in the late 20s and early 30s, of course, there were some horses around they used to bring in and shoe them, and that was interesting to a kid to go and watch him do that.
You bet.
And other than that, I can't remember. He was a swarthy gentleman, as I remember.
No, he wasn't. He didn't fit the poem, the village blacksmith.
Well, he didn't have a chestnut tree, if that's what you're getting at.
He have a what?
Didn't have a chestnut tree under which,
no, he didn't have
under
a
which to spread or anything.
No. He didn't have any of those kinds of things. But now, Perry Winkleman was actually a real craftsman. I mean, the old-fashioned
I would
blacksmith,
imagine, yes.
And he would do things that other people would not be able to do. If you remember, he used to have a
hand anvil and all that
right,
sort of
anvil
thing.
and the hand-driven
or not
forge.
anvil, but forge is what.
Forge, right? And he would get
anvil's what they beat on.
That's
right.
what they beat on, right? Do you remember when they were building City Hall?
Of course.
The first time. Tell us about that.
Well, I can recall going there and crawling around on the structure of the thing, you know, as a kid would do, and it was interesting to watch him do it and mix the cement and all that sort of thing. And
now, when you say mix the cement, how did they mix it compared to the way they do it now?
Well, they had the old-fashioned thing that it was like a shaped, round, and it went round and round and round, and you fed the sand and cement and mix all in a hole, and then they started the motor up and round it went, and then they'd dump it over into a wheelbarrow and carry it to wherever they needed to go.
And they didn't come with a great big truck and
no,
put
that
it
was
out
before
that
the
way.
days of the putsy.
No, that's right. Putsy is right. And what about how did they dig the hole for the foundation for the?
If I recall, they did it with a slip scraper with horses and things of that nature. They had mechanized, of course.
Tell us what a slip scraper is.
Well, a slip scraper thing is like a great big wide shovel with two handles sticking in the back, and you'd hook a horse or something on the front of it and go into the pile of dirt, and the man would hold it down. Sometimes it took two to grab a bucket full of dirt, and then they'd put the handles down and haul it off someplace and dump it wherever.
Now, this is going to be something that's extraordinary to people in the year 2014 when we celebrated 200th. They will never have heard of a slip scraper.
No.
But you saw them do that.
Yeah, I've seen them do it. In fact, later on in my life, I had the misfortune of having to work on one once in a while.
And they're tough to work on.
Oh, terrible.
Did you have a horse or did you have a tractor?
Well, it was a horse when I did it. Right.
That's at least, and you have to have 2 or 3 skills. 1 to guide the horse, 2 to make sure that the horse goes where you want it to go.
Normally you had somebody else to either
Guide the
ride
horse.
or lead the horse for him.
Now, when they start building City Hall, do you remember, of course, you were only about 9 or 10 years old at the time, but or 8 or 9 years old, do you remember anything about any controversies? I mean, they had to take a house down to build the City Hall at that place. Do you remember?
Well, I guess I don't recall, other than the blacksmith shop there, and of course on the corner there, Dr. Kramer, who was a dentist, had an office there. That was Marguerite Straighton's father.
Right.
They lived around the corner there, and I can recall that old gentleman as a child.
Dr. Kramer. Tell us about Dr. Kramer also. We've talked about Margaret
Well, he was
Straitman.
a tall gentleman that had a white beard, as I remember, and wore a top hat, and kind of a spooky kind of a fellow, to tell you the truth.
Spooky. Did you ever go into him as for?
No, I never went to him as a dentist.
Did
no.
you ever walk in to peek and see what he did?
Oh, sure. You'd
And
look in there and see what he was
What
doing.
was the equipment like?
Well, it was certainly a far cry from today. Of course, they had electric drills then.
They did have them
Oh,
by that time.
yeah, right. They had electricity when I was born. Anyhow, he had that equipment and so forth, and I can recall looking in there. That's about all, and seeing him working on people. But it was different than today, quite a bit.
Bill, we're going to bring you into some other kinds of buildings here in the city of Wadsworth, and we're going to start back with what your father did when he was in Wadsworth, and then we're going to be talking about another building that you watched being built in 1937. What did your father do?
Well, he came to Wadsworth, and I think he was with a gentleman by the name of Lytle, and they had an insurance agency. And
Where was the insurance
agency was on the north side of Broad Street. It would have been about 4 or 5 doors north. It was a building that consisted of a little basement where there was a barber shop at one time, and then above that were offices, and above that or beside it, they had living quarters.
Okay. Now, where was that on Broad Street?
Well, it would be what would represent about 3 or 4 houses east of Brenneman.
Right. In other words, where the bakery was, and
Well, the bakery it was next to the bakery, if you recall the bakery.
They had the bakery, and then they had Trent the tailor.
That's where my father had the insurance office,
Right.
with a gentleman by the name of Lytle. And
Now,
later on,
let's
by the
spell
name of
Lytle's
Draper.
name.
Lytle, I think.
Lytle. And what was his first name?
I think it was Frank.
Frank Lytle. And what was the name of the agency?
Lytle Dague.
Lytle Dague Agency. And how long did that last?
Oh, I don't know. I suppose in the very early 30s, he sold to a gentleman by the name of Draper. And
You remember Draper's first name?
No, sir.
Okay. And where was
I remember his son's first name was Wallace.
Wallace Draper?
Right.
And how old would Wallace be when you knew him?
Wallace, a couple, 3 years younger than I.
So he's probably born in 1925 or so.
Yeah, I would
Okay.
imagine.
So Mr. Draper could have well been born in 1900, somewhere in that area.
Yeah, I would assume.
Probably at this point would be close to 100 years old. We're trying to establish dates and times and things of this nature. What did your father do then when he sold the business?
All right. He coincidentally was involved in the automobile business, and just west of the bakery, which you mentioned, was his agency. And he sold Hudson's and Essex back in those days, which people kiddingly talk about today because they don't exist, as you well know.
No, they don't exist, but they were good cars.
At that time, they were
Very
pretty well
good car.
recognized automobile.
Now then, you say just west of his place.
Just west of the bakery was the
Agency.
his store, as they call them today.
Right, they stored that. And how many cars did he have in there?
I think you could probably get 3 in the
3.
place. I don't know.
And do you remember the Essex at all?
Oh, sure.
Describe an Essex to us, and usually the typical color of the Essex.
I would assume it was a dark color like black, and it was a square-built thing, and resembled all cars at that time. They all looked about the same. the spoked wheels and so forth.
That's
so
right.
on.
And what year would that have been?
Oh, I'm talking 29, 30 along in there.
And it was a
31.
tough time to be in business, as you well know.
It was.
How long did he have the Hudson Essex agency?
I can't be sure, but I would assume that would be in the mid-20s because he was involved with the Hilliard family. That would have been Frank's father and so forth, Frank Hilliard and them. And then I can't be sure of how he acquired the agency. I assume he bought it some way or worked out something with them.
And how were the Hilliards involved?
Well, I don't know if they started the agency or not, or what, but he got to selling for them or something of that nature, and the next thing, and prior to that even, they didn't have a showroom or anything of that nature, but back behind what is now the Marathon Station was a building back in there which is long since burned down, and they kept some cars back in there. I can recall going there as a kid, and that was about it.
Was where they also had the Buick agency. That's where Forey Wright was.
Yes, but it would have been east a little bit and north of that.
Okay, east and north a little bit. Then that's no longer there.
Right, neither one. Burned down many years ago.
Now, you were never old enough to drive any of these cars, obviously.
No.
And do you remember having an Essex in your family or a Hudson?
Oh, sure.
Which one did you have?
Well, we'd have both because, or a used one when he'd trade or something like this. It was always a different automobile because they were hopefully trading and selling them.
That's right. What did he do after the automobile agency then?
Well, he became the postmaster here in Wadsworth.
Postmaster in Wadsworth.
Right.
How did he become postmaster in Wadsworth? What was the avenue through which one became postmaster at that time?
Well, my father's leanings were Democratic. And of course, Franklin D. Roosevelt, as we all know, was a Democrat. And whenever the opening came along, he applied and was appointed to the position.
A very difficult thing to do.
I guess.
Very difficult thing to do. But he did it, and that's the way it was done. What year?
I would assume that he became postmaster along in 1933. I would imagine.
It would almost have to be because that's when Roosevelt took office.
Yeah, and it wasn't immediate because Mr. Westenberger stuck around as a Republican for some time, as long as he could, naturally.
That's right. And as you well know, we had Glenn Westenberger, the son of that postmaster.
I know Glenn, yes.
Yeah. We had him as one of our presenters, and now you're the next one in line because your father followed Worth Westenberger as the postmaster. Tell us what you remember about the post office and about his being the postmaster and the happiness that came with this kind of an appointment.
Well, it was fortunate at the time because the automobile business was pretty sad.
But we're talking depression.
Yes, sir. And the post office at that time was down on Main Street. In the building, I think, still exists there, although it has completely been remodeled from the way it was.
That was where the B&B store was.
It was where the B&B store was.
151 South Main Street, or just Main Street.
You have a very good recollection of that.
I used to work there.
Oh, did you really?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the safe is still in it because they couldn't get it out. Well, I don't know if it's there now, but they could not get it out. So
I recall that story now because they're working on it at the time when they built the new one.
This post office was down there. Tell us what you remember about the post office. First of all, were you permitted to go into the post office?
Oh, yes. One thing I distinctly remember, my father's little old office was on the corner as you went into the left, facing it was on the street. And there was a door that if you'd go and rap on the door and he wouldn't happen to be there, the gentleman who was the first clerk by the time, if he wanted to let you in, there was a wire hooked to the lock on the door, and he'd pull that wire and the lock would come open and you were admitted.
Just a little bit different.
That's one thing, that's probably the only thing I remember.
And that's just a little bit different from the type of security they have in post offices now.
Quite a bit.
They have cameras and alarms and everything else. I remember that door. As a matter of fact, that door, that little office that you're talking about, turned out to be the the storeroom for all of the waste paper and things of this nature. And the door was still there, and indeed, I can still remember that if we wanted to let someone in, for instance, the person who would pick up all of the rubbish, that we would have to pull a wire back.
That's exactly right.
All that secured the entire thing, and no one ever came in.
Right,
No one
and
ever came in.
there was the clerks were in the place, it was not enclosed. It was open above their head. And you went in there and transacted, bought your stamps and so forth. And at the end, at the west end, as I recall, they had the post boxes for the people that came and used those.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And that then turned out, then they had a bathroom at the very back on the south side.
Yeah, in the way in the rear.
Way in the back on the south side.
Mm-hmm.
The bathroom was probably not more than 6 by 6 or something like that.
Well, I can vaguely
Wash your hands if you were not too fat.
Right.
Now, they were there for about, well, until about 1937 or so. What happened in 1937?
Well, they built the post office that is no longer part of the main post office on Broad Street.
Broad Street.
Mm-hmm.
Who was the postmaster, and do you remember his coming to Wadsworth?
You mean the Postmaster General?
Postmaster General, I'm sorry.
Well, it was James A. Farley.
James A. Farley.
Right.
And he came for the dedication.
He came to Wadsworth, I think. My recollection is correct on this, for the dedication of that.
He did.
Of that.
And there's a story about that dedication, which you may or may not remember because you were not necessarily involved, although a friend of yours was involved, and that was Dick Curtis. Dick Curtis lived across the street from there, and James Farley was making a speech, and the poor guy got a dry throat, and he could not, under any circumstances, continue, and there was no water there, because, you know, we don't have those kinds of things available. We didn't at those times, in those days. I mean, electric outlets and water all over the place, and cups and things like that didn't exist. So they asked Dick Curtis to get him a glass of water.
Dick would remember that, of course.
Oh, he remembered it well. And Dick remembers getting the glass of water and taking it over to him and giving it to the postmaster so that he could make the speech. That, I just love that story. Dick tells that story, and I think that it's certainly worth telling.
Oh, yes.
Now, when we had the dedication, do you remember much about it?
No, I can remember being there, but I don't remember much about it. They had a stand, as I recall, out in front of the post office.
They closed the street off.
I'm sure they did, and they had Mr. Close, the superintendent of schools, and I don't know if Jerry Hall was mayor then or not, but whoever was the mayor was in attendance. And I think the congressman from the district was a gentleman named the name of Dow Harder.
Dow Harder.
And he, of course, was there.
Who introduced the speaker?
I don't recall. I would assume it would have been Mr. Harder. I don't know.
Could well be.
Right.
I'm not sure. I thought maybe your father might. Your father had a part in it, though, did he not?
Pardon?
Your father had a part in this.
Oh, yes. He did some introducing and so forth and so on. I'm sure, knowing him, he did some talking.
Now, this brings us to the point of something that is extraordinary about your father. He was quite an orator, wasn't he? Quite a speaker?
No, not that I recall particularly.
But was they were outgoing then?
Yes, he was of the old school, yeah, and he, taskmaster type.
Taskmaster type, right.
Of individual.
Do you remember the people who used to work with your father?
Oh, of course, I remember Smoke Thomas, Willard Thomas,
right,
who was
Willard Thomas.
the mainstay of the post office, of course, and there was a gentleman by the name of Overholt.
Which Overholt was it?
Phew.
We have Overholt, H-O-L-T.
Overholt. He lived up on Broad Street someplace, I think, but I can't. I can recall how the gentleman looked, but I can't. Frank Overholt. I'm not sure.
Okay, we'll find out.
And
because someone will
Lee
call me
Thompson.
tonight. Lee Thompson, right?
Right, and there were a couple Fultons involved.
Oh, a lot of Fultons. Yes, as a matter of fact, we still have some of those Fultons living.
Right. Pinky's father
Pinky.
was one of them, and I don't remember who else. And a gentleman by the name of Tom Johnson was a rural carrier. A gentleman by the name of Ray was another rural.
Bill Ray.
Bill
He
Ray.
was a rural carrier.
Right.
Bill Ray was our rural carrier, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
And Bill Ray's daughter was married to Tom Cox. And
That
then
is
she's
correct.
unfortunately she's gone
Right.
now.
Right.
But she was married to Tom Cox. Bill Ray was a tremendous person.
Very fine man.
Yes,
yeah.
he was. He drove a 1937 Plymouth. Well,
Very
yes, I remember
right.
that as if it were yesterday.
Of course.
And what about the, what do you remember about going into the new post office? Was it kind of a thrill that your dad was working at the new
Well, in a way, it was, of course, when they dedicated the thing, it was open to the public and they permitted people to go around and see. And one of the things that was a recollection for most anybody that ever went through the place, up in the ceiling and in behind they had the place where the inspectors could go and observe the workings of the employees in the post office, unbeknownst to them, and they came in and observed that to make sure that everything was hunky-dory.
You took the words out of my mouth, because as a small child, I was told, as other children my age were told, that the inspectors would come in the night. They had a key, they would come in the night.
They always had a key, right.
And they came, and no one ever knew that they were there, so that they could watch everything that's going on.
That's right.
That's actually true then.
Precisely.
Now, what did they do about going to the bathroom and things like this, or did they?
The inspectors?
Yes.
I have no idea what they did on that, because the one and only time I was ever permitted up there was when the thing was open to the public.
What was it like? That
Kind of like
that
a
box?
little catwalk back up in there, you know, and they could.
There was a box?
No, that seemed like they could go around the perimeter of the work area.
And no one could see them?
No, because there were little black slits in there with glass in, and they could, I don't know if they had that kind of glass in those days, but they were apparently unobservable in there.
Does your father ever remember, or did your father ever relate to you that he remembered that an inspector in there?
Oh, yes, because many times, either before or after their inspection, why they would come and talk to him, of course, you know, and he was acquainted with several of them. I remember, couldn't remember the man's name if my life depended on it, one of them coming to the house. See, my father brought him around, you know, and they talked, you know.
Now, did they ever find anything wrong?
Not to my recollection.
What were they looking for?
Well, I suppose they checked to make sure that there was no embezzlement or thievery or anything of that nature, anything
They'd be
untoward being done by the employees or of
They'd
all
be able to pick
description.
that up. We want to come back to the post office, but we have to get back to you because we will run out of time, as we always do. Your family, you weren't always single as a young boy. You got married, had children, and so forth. Tell us about whom you married.
Well, I married a girl by the name of Margaret Beasley, met her in college,
Where?
the University of Virginia.
What was she doing there?
She was attending the University of Virginia, as was I.
She was majoring in what?
Languages and education.
Languages and education. You were majoring in what?
I had history with a lot of economics and so forth thrown in.
And what did you do with that in your life career?
Well, upon graduation, I went to work for the Ohio Match Company.
And doing what?
Well, I started out in the credit department, and eventually, fortunately, I became an assistant treasurer. And when the things changed quite a bit, why I left there and under that in that position.
Okay. Now, hold that thought for a minute because we want to get back to Margaret Beasley.
All right.
Whom you call Peggy.
Queen Bee.
Queen Bee.
Right.
And Queen Bee is from where?
Well, she was born in Bronxville, New York, I think.
Bronxville, New York.
Bronxville, New York, suburb of New York City.
Say that again.
Bronxville, New York.
Bronxville. B-R-O-N-X?
V-I-L-L-E.
B-I-L-L-E, New York.
That's not to be confused
With the Bronx.
with the Bronx.
Right, okay. Bronxville, New York. Okay, we got that.
And then
straight.
she moved up to a town of Oswego, where they had
Oswego.
fantastic winters up there.
Fantastic.
Winters.
Winters, okay.
Right. She relates how she walked many miles to school in bitter cold and snow. Subsequently, she moved to Virginia because her father worked for Johns Manville, and they opened a plant in the southern part of Virginia in a small town called Jarrett.
Now,
Virginia.
Johns Manville at that time, as you well remember, was making asbestos, right?
That is exactly why I went there. They made the asbestos stuff.
And what happened to
Acoustical
Johns
tile they put in the
Manville?
ceiling. Pardon?
What happened to Johns Mansville?
It's been merged into what all I don't know over the years, but
Well,
it doesn't exist per se today.
Not as an asbestos maker, because that's we found
No, that is taboo.
yeah, that's completely gone. Excuse me. We married Queen Bee, Beasley, and I'll bet you're going to get slugged tonight for saying that on the air, or do you call her that all the time?
Well, she has become accustomed to it, yes.
I imagine she had become accustomed, from what I've understood about your personality, she's had to become accustomed to a lot of things. Is that accurate?
I've been told that.
You've been told that. What about some of the offspring?
Well, I have a daughter by the name of Sarah.
And where's Sarah, and whom did she marry?
Well, she married a gentleman from Madrid, Spain, and resides there with 3 grandchildren.
And he speaks Spanish.
He speaks Spanish and a little bit of English. He can speak more English than I can Spanish.
And what about her?
And she, of course, is very fluent in both.
In both. Isn't that wonderful? What do they do there?
He, by training, is an architect and has gotten involved in real estate and so forth.
And where do they live in Spain?
In Madrid.
Right in Madrid.
In the city of Madrid.
And do you visit them?
We were there for 6 weeks this last summer.
6 weeks.
Right.
Tell us.
And they put up with us for 6 weeks.
And they probably were thrilled that you were there.
For a while.
For a while. Tell us a little bit about their home in Madrid as compared to your home here in Wadsworth.
Well, I suppose one of the prime things that you remember and know about homes in Madrid and a lot of in Europe, there is a lack of wood, so everything is made of concrete.
Concrete.
And
Stone.
brick and mortar, and so forth. And very unusual house. It consists of what amount to 4 stories, about a room and a half wide, but well equipped in all of the essentials.
Tell us why they had the 4 stories.
That's the way it was built. They sit right one next to the other.
That's right. They are
all very close together.
Extremely close together.
In Madrid and in many European cities, what little traveling I've ever done, I found this to be true. Many people are apartment dwellers rather than
have to be
houses.
Because there are no lawns.
Very small.
Few lawns.
Right.
Now then, we're going to stay with daughter just for half a minute here,
Right.
because I think it's extremely important that we learn about that aspect of Wadsworth history too, because we have a girl from
It's
Wadsworth.
kind of getting far away from Wadsworth.
Yeah, I know, but she
when you
was
get to
from
Madrid,
Wadsworth.
right?
She's from Wadsworth.
Right, that's right.
And we have her over there,
Okay.
and we that'll be an interesting aspect of the history. Tell us, does she have children?
She has 3.
And how old are they?
She has, the eldest daughter, I think, is 14, a boy 12, and a girl that just turned 9.
Okay, in other words, none is married yet.
No.
When they're married, will they live in her house, one stack?
I wouldn't think so.
But many people in Spain do.
They tend to do that.
That's one of the reasons for the
Right.
for the 4 stories. How about your other children?
I have a son, lives here in Wadsworth,
Name?
William B. Dague.
That's the third
he's
one.
not a junior, but.
You're not a junior, William B. And you're William
E.
E. And your father was William I. I, E, and B.
I-E-B.
Tell us about William and what he does.
Well, he works for Strickland Mason in Rittman in the body shop there. He runs the body shop for them.
He runs the body shop.
Yeah, he's the supervisor of the body shop.
My brother Henry probably knew him very well because he was...
Right, no doubt. He has been, like most people that get involved in the automobile business, I've discovered, they work for several people during their careers. Right. And this he has done, and he is now with Strickland Mason.
Now, you know, there is an artistry in body shop work that is uncanny almost. Very few people know how to do it, and a very good one is as sought after as a good physician or a good anything else. They're good people. Does that take care of all 2 children?
That takes care of all 2 children. And he has a daughter which he's adopted from his wife, was previously married and had a daughter.
And they live where in Wadsworth?
Live out on Dale Drive, if you know
Dale
where
Drive.
that's
Oh,
at.
surely out in Clearview Acres.
Exactly right.
Now, Bill, let's go back to Queen Bee again here.
All
And
right.
I'm going to call her Peggy.
Probably
Because-
you should.
Yeah, because if I call her Queen Bee and she starts pounding on you for saying that in the air, I don't want to get part of that. See, I'm just going to call her.
She's
She's all right.
accustomed to it.
What did she do with her degree in education?
Well, she taught school for a while here around Wadsworth.
Where?
Well, she taught in the high school some. She substituted quite a bit and had a position at in the Granger School for a while.
In Granger?
And
In Highland?
then she got pregnant, and that was the end of her basic teaching career, although after that she did substitute.
Substituting.
Right.
And what does she do hobby-wise? And what do you do hobby-wise?
Well, she is a great collector of antiques and
In
arts
addition
and
to you.
crafts. Pardon?
Antiques in addition to you.
Right, the other antique, right. And she interests herself in many, many things.
And how about you?
Well, I enjoy golf, such as it is
Golf.
today.
Okay.
And, I enjoy reading. I enjoy watching the Indians when they win, but, and so forth and so on.
Now, well, let's go back to the mat shop. We were holding that
Okay.
thought. You became the assistant treasurer of the mat shop.
Mm-hmm.
And who were some of the people that worked with you at the time?
Well, you've got a lot of them. There was, of course, Mr. Don Young was the president.
We hope to have Don Young's daughter, Virginia, as one of our guests very
That,
soon.
she would be a natural.
Yeah, she would be very good.
Right. And
You went to school with her, didn't
that's
you?
correct. She was in the same class.
Same class. Virginia probably was born in 22 as well.
I would imagine they're about.
Married a fellow from Akron,
Yes.
and she's been there pretty well ever
Many,
since.
many years, right.
Nice girl.
Very
nice
lovely
girl.
lady.
Right. Tell us about the treasurership down there and who worked with you,
Well,
secretaries and
of
things
course,
of this nature.
I mentioned Mr. Young and Mr. Harry Coughlin. Joe Neath was there. Don Williams was there when I first went there. And I worked directly under Mr. Bill Simister.
Bill Simister. These
Right.
are all names which have been in Wadsworth for years and years
Right.
because the mat shop was the pillar,
Well, it was, right, it was the big employer in
the
Wadsworth.
big employer. How many did we employ at that time when you were down there? It was probably at its peak,
I would
wasn't it?
suppose they employed 500 or 600 there.
Oh, really? I thought it'd be more than that even.
Well, it could have been. I'm not real sure.
What years did you work at the match,
I worked
Bill?
from there from 48 to 57.
48 to 57.
What happened basically there in the fall of 56, they sold the reproduction book match department. And that, of course, cut back quite a bit. And at that time, the administrative offices were taken out of Wadsworth and moved to Fullerton, where the Hunt people who owned the match company held forth. And so it was a case of, well, they just ran out of job. And that's when I left the match company.
And we're going to find out what you did from there, but let's talk a little bit more about the people who worked
Sure,
with
I
you.
could go on for a long time on that. Wes Allen, I think
Wes
Wes Allen
Allen.
was on your program.
Yes, he was on our
Claude
program.
Edis, Bill Schenck, Harry Bowers.
How about secretaries?
Of course, Thelma Way Schaefer was Mr. Williams' secretary, and she was
Thelma
Mrs.
Way's
Mash.
father was
Pete Way
Pete
ran the
shipping
room.
Right.
Exactly.
I used to work for him
Down in the shipping room.
down in the shipping room. I was a mule.
Right, I imagine that.
Yes, I was. But
Pete was of the old school.
Oh, let me tell you. But he was a good man.
Very fine man.
I enjoyed Pete. He was a great person. They had do you remember the shipping room at all? The match had this huge, about 12 or 15 or 16 foot wash area, which was made out of ceramic or wood or stone or something. And they had live steam piped to that and cold water. And you went there and you pressed your foot on a ring, and if you pressed down a little bit, the live steam came out, and then pressed down some more, and the water would come
came
out,
out.
and it would be warm water. Well, it certainly was warm water, but if you didn't press down far enough, you would have nothing but live steam, and there's a lot of live steam. I mean, I don't know where it's coming from, but there's a lot of live steam. I thought time and time again what OSHA would have done with something like that.
Oh, my.
They would have had a lot of fun. Now, do you realize that during the time that I was working there as a mule, and a mule is a person who pushes these carts around filled with
For the
matchboxes,
matches.
that's right, that you were my boss.
Well, very,
you-
very indirectly.
Oh, you paid me, didn't you?
Well,
That's my boss.
yeah.
Never thought at that time that I'd be interviewing the person.
Were you working there in the late
summer.
40s?
I
in the
worked
summers?
there for 49 because they paid about 12 or 13 cents more than the injector, and I was going to school at the time, and I worked there for a summer. Then they laid me off from that in the middle of the summer because somebody else came back and I was taking that person's place,
Right.
and they then transferred me to second shift, and I was an inspector in the book match. Well, the first night that I was there, I counted at least 40 or 50 fires because they were always
Very
flaring
little,
up.
right.
The second night that I was there, I didn't know that there was a fire.
Right.
Because they were so frequent. I mean, there would be a huge, huge blaze, and then
But everybody knew exactly what to do to extinguish it.
no one didn't lose a heartbeat on something
No.
like that. And I was watching the stitchers, and they would take 12 and 13, 12 and 13. and
Those
never-
ladies were fantastic. They knew just how to
Exactly.
grab and.
It's just phenomenal what they would be able to do. My job was to wait until they had a whole box of these little things, and they had about 60 or 70 of those boxes. Someone would put them into my carton. I would tear off a little slip that said 13, inspected by 13, put it in there, and waited for the next box. I thought I would die of boredom, but I was making $1.03 an hour. And I
Right,
thought to
that was,
myself,
in those days, that was not
a
all
lot
bad
of money. You bet it was a lot of money.
Did you, was Ed Atkinson there? Was he the
Yes, he was.
superintendent?
Yes, mhm.
Right, I remember Ed.
Yes, and
Marty Booz was there?
Marty Booz is
Stuart
there.
Spicer?
Marty Booz, yes. mhm.
Okay. Those were book
I
match-
worked directly
those were
for
book match
Spice.
foremen?
Pardon me?
They were foremen in the book match.
Yes,
Art Mall, right?
And Cartwright.
Right.
I worked directly for Cartwright. What was
Mm-hmm.
it? Not Art Cartwright. That was his son.
Not Kenneth either.
No. He lived on Mill Street.
Right.
I can't think of his name right this
I can
second.
see him, but I can't
Yeah.
say his name now, unfortunately.
Right, and tons and tons of women. As a matter of fact, they were all women.
right. Many, many women in there handling the
Like
in the stitching
something
department.
like 100, 125.
I would imagine.
Easily.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a break every 2 hours, and those stitches were so loud that you can absolutely not hear yourself think.
That's right.
And the second the whistle blew for the break, there was dead silence.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of the break, 15 minutes later, they would start up again. You would hear 1, then 2, and then 10, and then 20, and then finally build up that horrible cacophony, and then it would die again.
A name that comes to mind here that I'm sure you remember was Charlie Albers,
You bet,
who was the fire chief,
right?
and I would assume you would call him the general foreman. He was.
He was.
The general
The
foreman.
general foreman, he did.
Quite a character. Charlie worked there for over 50 years.
Am I allowed to tell a little story about one of the secretaries who called me to tell me that she knew that you were going to be on the program? And she said that, tell us how you used to drink your coffee. If you wanted to stir your coffee.
Are you talking about Francis Santos, perchance?
No. This is a younger one.
Oh, I guess I used to use the stem on my specs and stir with that.
That's right. And then, well, how did you clean the stems on your specs when you were done with your coffee?
I suppose on my shirt or something.
On your necktie.
Oh, was it? I'd forgotten that, but now that you tell me,
That's
you're
right,
right.
on your necktie. They thought that was first of all, they dearly loved you. They thought you were just the most wonderful person in the world to work with because you made such a drudgerous job, in numbers
Well,
and finances. So you made it fun.
That's sweet of them to say that.
Well, not only did they say that, but all the people, you can't believe the number of people who called me to ask me to get you on the program. Because
Really?
Well, yes. Mm-hmm. So, there's something about being the lighthearted, the warm, the effusive kind of a person that people like. I mean, this is something that happened, 50 years ago, isn't it? Well, 48.
Well, 1948
was
will
49
be 50 years
next
coming
year.
up.
Yeah, and you were there up until
57.
57, which is 40 years ago. And they still remember that. I bet they don't remember
They got
any-
better memory than I do. Then.
Well,
I'll tell
they're
you
younger
that
than you
necktie
are.
thing.
Your
Okay.
secretaries. Now, let's go back, if we can, to your father here to the post office. We talked about the mail routes, and we talked about the rural mail routes, and also the city walking routes. Who were some of the walking people that worked for your father?
Well, one of the mail carriers.
Yes, right. Mhm.
One that I can recall was a Fulton, for sure. I think there was a gentleman by the name of Barnett, although I'm not sure. Earl Days comes to mind as a gentleman who was a mail carrier, and later on I think he worked inside.
Right. Earl
And he had
Days
been a
did.
photographer here in Wadsworth
Right.
at one time.
And his wife worked at the dime store, and
Mm-hmm.
Marilyn is his daughter,
All right.
and Richard is his son. I believe that's the same
Right,
one.
right. I remember the name Richard now
Right,
that you
right.
mentioned
And
it.
Marilyn,
Right.
and Marilyn married Martin Fulton.
Could.
I'm almost sure it's Fulton. Did you ever work at the post office?
No.
Was there a reason that you didn't?
Well, one thing, I was, to begin with, too young. Then I was in college, and then went in the service. And by then, I came back from the service, finished college, and then went to work for the match company. So there would be no reason for me to, or even
Work in the
think about
post
doing
office.
it.
Would
Right.
you have been permitted to, since your father's a postmaster?
Pardon?
Would you have been permitted to?
I have no idea.
Probably,
Probably not, because it was back in those days, as you know, the position of postmaster was completely political.
You bet.
Which they talked about civil service, but it wasn't to that extent that it is today. Now today, as I understand, the postmaster is a civil servant.
Civil servant, that's right.
Right, right.
Tell me, we need to hurry along because we won't have enough time here, but when you went to college, when you were in high school, who were some of the outstanding teachers you remember who might have motivated you to be the person that you were after you left high school?
They wouldn't admit it. Well, of course, there was O.J. Work.
Everyone remembers him.
Remembers him. And of course, Mr. Close was there. And Mr. Sunderman was a chemistry teacher.
J.T. Lape.
And Mr. Late taught English. And of course, Art Wright was there teaching history and then coaching and so forth and so on.
Did you play any ball in school?
No, I didn't. I played a little bit of basketball one year and then that ended. But then, of course, there was Miss Billman. She taught French there for years. And I can't imagine Miss Billman having a very good thing to say about me. Anyhow, there were a number of them. Willard Huntsberger taught history. A man by the name of Grunwald taught history.
Harvey Grunwald.
Harvey Grunwald.
All of the people you've just mentioned are all gone now, I believe.
I believe. I don't know about Miss Billman, but she could be.
Well, she was up in years at that time.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
so
yeah.
if you're 75, she'd at least be 95 to 100.
Right, right.
And what about
D.K. Bennett? He was the
band director?
band and music man.
Now, were you in band?
No, sir.
No.
Right.
We mentioned
I had
yesterday.
trouble playing radio.
Radio, but you do play the radio.
Right.
If the Indians are winning.
If, yes, and right.
And if they're not winning, you don't.
So last night was too bad, but anyhow, that's beside the
those
point.
things happen, right. Now then, let's get a little bit more of your collegiate work. How did you happen to go to the University of Virginia?
Well, it's a kind of a long story, but let's just leave it to say I was accepted.
You were accepted, that's good.
Right, and I discovered after I was there that it was a very fine school.
Oh, the University of Virginia, one of the finest in the country.
Enjoyed it quite well. Of course, all the more so because I met the wife.
That's right. How did you meet her?
Oddly enough, at that time, I had met her. I knew who she was. But one fine day, a fraternity brother of mine thought that it would be nice if we had a bridge game and invited girls. He was going with a girl, and Peggy is her roommate. So he said to her, why don't you invite her and we'll play bridge. We had a couple tables of bridge. I tried to play bridge then. I didn't do very well then, don't today. And that was how we met, and one thing led to another, and we became acquainted, and I courted her for about a year, and then she finally tolerated me to the point she said yes.
She said yes.
Right. So,
where were you married, Virginia or here?
and the chapel at the University of Virginia. Yes.
And when were you married?
1948, August the 23rd.
23rd, August 23rd, 1948.
Right. Uh-huh.
That's of no particular significance. I
Right.
mean, in terms of this conversation that we're having now, that was the date my mother died on August 23rd, 1973. Now, that's no connection, but just by
Right,
coincidence.
the coincidental of the same date.
Coincidental of the dates there. And then you were married while you were in school, right? Or,
No, I graduated the day before.
okay, you graduated on the 22nd of August, and then you married her on the and then you went from there to here in Wadsworth.
There.
Where did you live when you first came to Wadsworth, Bill?
We lived in a chicken coop behind where the was a converted chicken coop behind the brick house on High Street, which at that time was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Carl Schaefer.
Right, and the chicken coop was much, much better than most houses are.
Well, I wouldn't say better, but it was a place to hang the hat and so forth and so on.
And how long did you live there?
We lived there, I would guess, about, with you about 3 years, because the daughter Sarah was born there.
She was born there.
And then we moved up onto Broad Street and so forth and so on.
Now, when you were living in the chicken coop, what was the feeling that you had knowing that that had been a chicken coop? But now tell us out of, a complete honesty, what it really looked like.
Well, it was, you could tell it had been a chicken coop because the part we lived in was 2-story and the other part was 1-story. And if I recall correctly, they had taken down the ventilators and so forth from the roof and made it completely identifiable as a chicken coop, but it was, and
we all. It was a large chicken coop.
Oh, yes.
It was a very large chicken coop, because in those days in the city you could have chickens.
Oh, of course.
And almost everyone
Back
did.
in there, they had a pond and so forth, and right.
I was physically born, in a reconditioned barn, which it's still standing, but it's not standing.
Where would this be, man?
In Silver Creek.
Oh, yes.
And if it were still standing on that spot, it had been moved there from across the street, and if we're still standing on that spot, it would have been there for over 200 years.
Oh, really?
Yes, it was.
That good long time.
It predated the history of Ohio, and it was a coal mining town down in Silver Creek, and
very much so.
At least that's what I was told. I obviously wasn't there to see that, and never did I feel that I was living in a reconditioned barn, except that it was. A solid structure, but it certainly wasn't insulated or anything of this nature. You have 2 or 3 things here that have been outstanding in your lifetime, and we unfortunately are coming very close to the end of the hour, so we want to quickly grab some more documentation here. The first thing that I guess the fact that you were born, because you said 1922 was a good year, so that was the first thing that really happened that was outstanding. Second thing was that you are the son of the Wadsworth postmaster who followed Worth Westenbarger, and during whose administration the new post office was built in 1937, and James Farley came and all of that. It was the first time I think that we've ever had, and I'm sure I'll be corrected on this if I'm wrong, the first time we ever had a postmaster general come to Wadsworth to...
Could be.
I think that's correct. I'm not positive, but I think that's correct. The third thing is that, and probably the most important, is that you married Peggy.
Very much so.
Brought her to Wadsworth to then grace our city with this person who had been your choice. And then you went to the match shop and became the assistant treasurer. Now, tell us what you have done and what you continue to do in your retirement, which still is very active as part of Wadsworth.
After I left the match company, I went to work for the Ohio Box Board Company.
You stayed with the Ohio companies.
Right, and then, as you know, that became part of Packaging Corporation and Tenneco and so forth and so on. And in 1972, a fellow with whom I had worked for a number of years at PCA and so forth, gave a call from Dallas, Texas one afternoon and said, would you be interested in going to work in Texas?
Doing what?
In sales, selling, and so, which I had done at the box board. And so we loaded up and went down and interviewed, and for some reason they accepted me, and we went down there and have made that our home ever since. Come here in the summers, play some golf with some gentlemen here every Wednesday and Saturday.
Tell us with whom you play golf.
Well, of course, there's Mr. Bill Booty Parmley and Bill Reimer and Ed Bates and John Schick and Carl Schantz.
Carl's gone, though, isn't he?
Pardon?
Carl's gone, or young Carl.
Well, Carl Schantz, the attorney, yeah, he went back to Florida last week.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, Bob Downey and, I could go on.
A lot of them.
Oh, yes, right.
The unfortunate thing is that these hours go so quickly. We are finished. We have no more time left, and we want to thank you, Bill Dague, for bringing us a part of history that only you have, and we are grateful to you.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for putting up with me.